Hola, buen dia. It's me, Peppermint. And when I'm not on RuPaul's Drag Race or simply being New York City's sweetest diva, I'm tuned into the fabulously empowering Bayard Rustin Center for Social Justice Power Hour, coming to you every weeknight at 7 p.m. live from our good old friends at the BRCSJ Virtual HQ via their Facebook page. Tune in tonight.
Need in every community a group of angelic troublemakers.
Social justice, power hour, power hour, power hour. Social justice, power hour, power hour, power hour.
Good evening to our friends on the East Coast. Good afternoon to our friends in the West, and good in-between time to our friends in those in-between spaces. Welcome, 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 my friends. Welcome to the Social Justice Power Hour. Welcome to the virtual headquarters of the Bayard Rustin Center for Social Justice. My name is Robert Martin Say-the-Schreiber. I'm the chief actress here at the center, and your host for this evening, as I have been for the past year and 8 months. Over 450 some odd shows, many of them very odd indeed. The Social Justice Power Hour has come at you every single freaking weeknight since the pandemic started. We're so proud that you join us in this virtual community. Thank you. Today is World AIDS Day, and it's a day that we remember those we have lost and fight like hell for those that are still with us. And we thought no better occasion than to bring back one of our favorite episodes with Sarah Schulman, who wrote the incredible book, Let the Record Show. Let the Record Show is this beautiful political history of ACT UP New York from 1987 to 1993. Sarah was incredible on the show. We talked about organizing. We talked about the history of the AIDS crisis and the reaction thereof, and how what a great movement was born from it, and how pivotal she herself was in it. You'll enjoy this show. You'll be empowered by this show. It is the very epitome of what we want the Power Hour to be. So thank you for joining us, and we're thrilled to bring this back to you. And before we start the show, we do want to share with you some highlights, just some highlights of what's coming up on the Power Hour, because I know that some of you are tuning in for the first time. Sarah is a big draw, and World AIDS Day is an important moment for us to share. So welcome. If it is your first time, you're going to enjoy this. And for those of you who've seen it the second time, you're going to catch all the subtle nuances. But coming up on the Power Hour, so you'll come back to us, here are things that are coming up. As I said, we've done this almost 500 times now, and we have some extraordinary moments like tonight. And tomorrow night is our usual Throwback Thursday, where we bring back some shows that are really meaningful. And to celebrate the 1-year book-anniversary of The Black Friend, How to Be a Better White Person, Frederick Joseph, our old friend, we're going to replay that episode. It's really extraordinary, so tune in for that, my friends. And then Friday, it's the first Friday, y'all. You know what that means, First Folk Friday, or First Friday Folk. Dave Brzezinski and friends, Guy DeRosa and Naomi Bolton come and kind of ease into the weekend with us to be back into the beautiful struggle the next week. And then coming up on the Power Hour, we just booked this thrilled Michael Tubbs, a memoir of hope and home, the deeper the roots, the youngest ever elected mayor in an American city. What a story. And he has a pretty fabulous wife, too. Google him, and you'll see what I'm talking about. The End of Burnout. This is a double shot of holiday shows that we're doing. The End of Burnout with Jonathan Malezic. This is a great way for us to kind of work our way through the holiday season, which becomes a wonderful festive time for many. But for some of us who are working, especially in the social justice field, it becomes a time when we need to kind of take a breath. So Jonathan's going to come and help us with that. And then for the holiday season, we're going to be talking to a lot of our friends and family, and some of those conversations are sometimes difficult. So we're bringing on Lee McIntyre, How to Talk to a Science Denier. This will be a great primer for you to have some of those conversations, I think. We have The Shattering Kevin Boyle. This is a great new lens on America in the 1960s. Bringing at you our old friend Adam Gopnik, Radical of the Real, one of the greatest minds of our generation, coming with his monthly ruminations here in the Power Hour. Of course, Queer Yoga every Tuesday night, come take a breath with us, both literally and figuratively, as Queer Yoga Master Jasmani brings us to virtual nirvana. And finally, you can't be serious, my friends. We had an embargo on this. Finally, we can talk about it. Cal Penn came out. Now we can come out and talk about his inspirational journey. Cal will be here on the Power Hour, so stay tuned, true believers. That's going to be an extraordinary event as well. All that stuff is coming up in the Power, and that's just some highlights. Just some highlights. But tonight, my friends, we commemorate World AIDS Day. We bring on our old friend Sarah Schulman to talk about Let the Record Show. Here's the book again. There's a link in the comment section for you to purchase this incredible, impactful, pivotal book. Please do so, and please enjoy this conversation. I'll be back on the flip side to say goodnight to all y'all. But until then, much love and respect, and thanks for being with us. Build, and that we will continue to build. But speaking of community, speaking of building, speaking of the importance of our history, 20 years in the making, Let the Record Show, a political history of ACT UP New York, 1987 to 1993, is the most comprehensive political history ever assembled of ACT UP and American AIDS activism. Its inspirational author, Sarah Schulman, is a longtime AIDS and queer activist and the author of more than 20 works of fiction, nonfiction, and theater. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, The New Yorker, Slate, and many other outlets. She is a distinguished professor of humanities at the College of Staten Island, a fellow at the New York Institute of Humanities, the recipient of multiple fellowships from the MacDowell Colony, Yaddo, and the New York Foundation for the Arts. She is also the co-founder of the Mixed New York LGBTQ Experimental and Film Video Festival, the co-director of the groundbreaking ACT UP Oral History Project. A lifelong New Yorker, she is a long-term activist for queer rights and female empowerment, and serves on the advisory board of Jewish Voice for Peace. As our friend Alexander Chi says, quote, Sarah Schulman has written more than an authoritative history of ACT UP New York here. It is a masterpiece of historical research and intellectual analysis that creates many windows into both the vanished world and the one that has emerged from it, the one we live in now. Any reader will be changed, I think, by the stories here, radicalized and renewed, which to me is something better than just hope. So let us, my friends, be radicalized and renewed tonight. And please join me in welcoming our honored guest to our Byron Center for Social Justice Power Hour, Sarah Schulman, to do just that. Sarah, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Well, thank you so much, and congratulations to being able to pull this community together every night of the epidemic. That's phenomenal.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It means the world coming from you. You've been doing the do. So what's wonderful about this book and all of your work, it's all about not only our history, which is so important for us to bring to the forefront, but it's about connecting us to the present and also informing our future. Has that been
Right.
Has that been always your goal? Has that been always the vision that you've had with all the work you've done? It seems like that's a connecting thread.
I mean, otherwise it would just be an exercise in nostalgia, and there's no point to that. I mean, we're in a very strange time in our country right now. It's very dangerous. There's a lot of people who really want substantive change in how our lives are structured, our collective lives, and getting access to activist information, what strategies and tactics movements use. It's very hard to get that. So it just seemed, since ACT UP was one of our most successful social movements, to, cohering what strategies and tactics worked and what didn't work, felt like very important information for today's activists.
And that's the part that I found most fascinating. There are two parts of it that I found most fascinating. One is that I want to make sure that our viewers understand this is more of an oral history, so it's really, you feel like you're immersed in it almost the entire time you're reading the book. And the other part is that you do tell the story, foibles and all. You make sure that you focus on the strengths and the weaknesses of the movement and the successes and the failures, because I think it's important that we learn from that as well.
Right. And that real people are the ones who make change. You know, you don't have to be a saint to be a successful activist.
Yeah, I think that. So tell us about that. As you're working toward you, I mean, you've been doing this work for literally decades, and it's evolved as an oral history. When was it? And I guess I want to go back to your journey personally. When was it your decision to say, "There's a book here. There's not only a book, but it's a beautifully big book that allows us to really dive in." When was that decision made that this will be something that has to be more than just something we hear, we need to read, we need to have it on a shelf?
Well, it really goes way, way back. So let's go back to how I got involved with AIDS in the first place. So in the late 70s, there were a series of underground newspapers that reported feminist news and gay and lesbian news because we were completely ignored by the mainstream press. And these were newspapers like Woman News, which was a straight and gay feminist newspaper in New York, the New York Native, which was a gay male newspaper, Gay Community News, which was a gay and lesbian paper from Boston. And the young journalists who were working these papers, like myself, we all worked for free. But we ran around trying to find what the real stories were, interviewing people doing the research. Otherwise, our communities would have had no coverage. So at that time, I was working at City Hall for the New York Native. Now, this was because there was no gay rights bill in New York City. So we're going back to the early 80s. And what that meant was you could be fired from your job, you could be kicked out of your apartment, and you could be denied public accommodation. You could literally be thrown out of a restaurant or denied a hotel because you were gay or lesbian. And the mayor, Ed Koch, was closeted. And this was the most important thing to the community, was getting the gay rights bill. So I was going to, press conferences at City Hall and asking Koch, when are we getting a gay rights bill? In 1981 is when science first observed the pattern of disease that we now know of as AIDS. But AIDS actually existed long before, maybe for up to 100 years before. It certainly was in New York in the 60s and 70s. But when science first noticed the pattern, it was announced to the public in a New York Times story, July 3rd, 1981. And the headline was, rare cancer, 41 cases of rare cancer found in homosexuals in San Francisco. Now, to go back to 1981, this was a time when people were obsessed with the cause of homosexuality. They had this idea that homosexuality was one thing, which we know that it's different in each person, and that it had a cause. And, just trying to find out a cause of something is already stigmatizing. Like, no one's running around trying to find out why people like sports, right? But it was because homosexuality was still considered a pathology. It was still illegal. And the theories at the time were that it was biological, that you were homosexual because your hypothalamus did a certain thing. I mean, it's like pseudoscience. But so when they said rare cancer found in homosexuals, there was this implication that the disease of homosexuality itself was biological. And so this new disease was linked to the pathology, the biological pathology of homosexuality. So the first name of this disease was gay-related immune deficiency, GRID. And because I was at City Hall, I started covering it. So for the first 5 years, I covered mostly social justice issues related to AIDS. Now, you have to remember that the New York Times, which ACT UP called the New York Crimes, ignored AIDS for the most part. So the only coverage was in our underground radical queer newspapers. So I covered things like pediatric AIDS. A lot of people were born HIV positive in New York City, and they were mostly poor. So there was a whole issue around infants with AIDS. I covered women being excluded from experimental drug trials. I covered the homeless and AIDS. But I also covered community issues. So I covered when the health department closed the bathhouses, or I covered the first arrest of a PWA, David Summers, who was doing civil disobedience at City Hall. So I was on the beat. And then, so for the first 5 years of the AIDS crisis, 40,000 people died in the United States. Now, to date, we think about 600,000 people have died of AIDS in the United States and about 100,000 in New York City. But this was 40,000 in the first 5 years. The government did absolutely nothing, and pharmaceutical companies did nothing. They owned the patents to failed cancer drugs that they were recycling in hopes that they would find something, a pill that you could take that would cure your AIDS, because it was a potentially huge market. But they were not doing the research that needed to be done. And the gay community was kind of trying to create some facsimile of social services, because not only did gay people not adequately served, but familial homophobia was so prevalent in this period that a lot of people with AIDS were just abandoned by their families. So what you see in those first few years is organizations like Gay Men's Health Crisis had a buddy system where you would volunteer and you'd be assigned a person with AIDS and you'd try to help them, do their grocery shopping or just talk to them. There was a group that walked people's dogs called Paws. There was God's Love We Deliver, that was founded by Ganja Stone, who just passed away a few weeks ago, that would bring home-cooked meals for free to people with AIDS. But there was no political response. Then in 1987, a few things happened right before ACT UP. The Supreme Court had what was called the Bowers v. Hardwick decision, which upheld sodomy laws. They maintained that sodomy laws were legal. And this was a huge slap in the face to the gay community. Here's people going through the AIDS crisis, abandoned, and now the Supreme Court is saying gay sex is illegal. And of course, those laws were upheld until 2003, if you can believe that. So gay people were enraged. There were demonstrations in the streets without permits. People were very, very angry. Right before ACT UP was founded in March 1987, there were two affinity groups that surfaced. One was a graphics collective called the Silence Equals Death Collective, and they made that famous image, the upside-down pink triangle. It says Silence Equals Death, just what's on your T-shirt, and against a black background, and we pasted it all over the city. And then there was a ZAP group called the Lavender Hill Mob. Now, a ZAP was a strategy that came from the gay liberation movement. And to do a ZAP, you have to really be marginalized, because it's about busting in on the people with power and disrupting everything. And so the Lavender Hill Mob dressed up in concentration camp uniforms and did a ZAP at the CDC. So things were brewing, people were angry, and things were happening. And then the writer Larry Kramer gave a talk at the Lesbian and Gay Center on West 13th Street, and he famously said, "Half of you will be dead in 2 years." The audience decided to meet. They wanted to meet together and try to start a political response. So a few days later, a large number of people met, and they started the name ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, as a direct action political response to AIDS. In the next 6 years, which are the years that I cover in my book, 1987 to 1993, ACT UP won amazing victories. I mean, you really could argue that ACT UP was the most recent successful social movement in America. What they accomplished through direct action was they forced science to change the way it researched medications. Because AIDS is like an umbrella term. It's like the word cancer. It's actually different in each person. And what it really means is that your immune system doesn't work. So you get these horrible opportunistic infections, and that's what kills you. So people became demented or blind. They would, in a sense, starve to death because their bodies couldn't process nutrition. These were all different infections. And ACT UP really pushed science to focus on the infections rather than this one cure. ACT UP forced the government to change the definition of AIDS so that women with HIV could qualify for benefits and for experimental drugs. ACT UP forced the Food and Drug Administration to make experimental drugs available to people who needed them, even if they had not gone through the approval process. ACT UP made needle exchange legal in New York City, which transformed the AIDS crisis in New York. ACT UP stopped the Catholic Church from inhibiting condom distribution in the public schools. ACT UP also made it that people who were HIV positive could qualify for private insurance. And this made 500,000 people eligible for insurance. And, even in some large way, ACT UP changed the way that queer people and people with AIDS saw themselves, and also how they were seen in the public, because ACT UP really transformed how people with AIDS were depicted in the media. So these were very substantive victories. In 1992, ACT UP had a split, 12 members left, and started a group called Treatment Action Group. And even though hundreds of people stayed behind, the split was really difficult and people were demoralized. And there were a lot of people had died in ACT UP, and there were no good drugs, and people were dying, and it was very depressing, and the group diminished. It still exists, but it diminished at that time. In 1996 is when the protease inhibitors were made available, and those were the beginning of the good drugs. The drugs where if you become HIV positive today and you have access to the standard of care, you can live a full lifespan. That began. So people who thought they were going to die realized they weren't going to die, and they started retreating to their corners to pull their lives together, and everything kind of dissipated. And then 99 is really the internet revolution, and everything goes online, and ACT UP's material was not digitized. So if you searched ACT UP at a certain point, you really wouldn't find anything, and it was like we disappeared from public memory. So in 2001, I was driving around and I was listening to the radio, and they were saying it was the 20th anniversary of AIDS. Actually, it's the 20th anniversary of observing AIDS. But anyway, and the guy on the radio was saying, at first, America had trouble with people with AIDS, but then they came around. And I almost crashed the car. I thought, no, that's not what happened. Actually, what really happened is that thousands of people fought until the day they died to force this country to change against its will. So I was very worried that this fake story about straight people's benevolence and natural progress and all of this was going to come into being. So I called my collaborator, Jim Hubbard, with whom I had founded the Mix Festival, which was a queer experimental film festival that lasted 33 years. And we decided that we would start the ACT UP Oral History Project. So if anyone's interested, they can go to our website, actuporalhistory.org. And we then interviewed 188 surviving members of ACT UP over the next 18 years through funding that we got from Urvashi Vad, who was a great leader of our movement, at the Ford Foundation. And we made all the transcripts available for free. And we've had 14 million hits on this website. So we interviewed all these people, and our idea was that someone out there, some academic or somebody, was going to analyze this raw data and write something about it. But it kind of never happened. And then Jim directed a film called United in Anger, A History of ACT UP, that uses archival footage that he had preserved with James Wency, and intercuts it with our interview footage. And you can watch this film for free on Canopy or YouTube. It's called United in Anger. And Jim and I took the film, literally carried it around the world. We showed it in Brazil and India. We showed it in Russia right after the anti-gay laws were passed. We showed it in Palestine, Abu Dhabi, Lebanon. We showed it all over the world to people with AIDS, and we met people with AIDS all over the world. But something else then occurred, which was at this point, a certain kind of history started to be made about ACT UP that was really false. And what it did was it sort of washed away the large groups of people and the wide range of actions and the simultaneity. And it focused on this American concept, this kind of John Wayne, white male heroic individual who saves the day. So suddenly it was like Larry Kramer is the leader of ACT UP. And, I just tell you, I've interviewed 188 members of ACT UP, and not one person thinks Larry Kramer was the leader of ACT UP. That was like a media invention because they needed the white male hero. Or then it was like these 5 guys from the Treatment and Data Committee were the ones who saved the day. And they did great work. In my book, I honor them and I report what they did. But they were just one group of many, many different kinds of people. So what was happening was not only was the history being distorted, but contemporary activists were being given the wrong idea. Because if you're telling people that 5 people are going to change the world, you're not telling them something that's helpful to them. Because in America, it's coalitions that make systemic change. And it's communities and collectivities and simultaneity of response is how paradigms are shifted. So it was kind of a state of emergency of misrepresentation. And we kept looking for somebody to write a book. And we couldn't find anybody, and finally we decided that I was going to have to do it. And I had conducted all but 2 of the interviews, so I knew what was in them. So I took 3 years and sat down and reread all the interviews, and I started to write this book. And the first thing I realized was that I couldn't write it chronologically because it wouldn't be accurate. Because so much was happening at the same time that was like the success of the organization, was how many different kinds of people were doing different kinds of actions at the same time. That's what propelled it. So fortunately, I'm a novelist. I'm primarily a novelist, and I've written a lot of different kinds of novels, including some that are formally inventive and experimental, and some that are, traditional literary novels. And so I had a lot of experience with form. And of course, Jim and I had been working in experimental film all these years, so I had learned a lot about form. So I had the skills to be able to create a kind of horizontal structure for the book, where I could cohere certain tropes or moments that would resonate together, that would convey the strengths of ACT UP. So I wrote the book in about 3 years. So that's how it happened.
It's fascinating because to me it seems like you are the exact right person to write the book, and it's really interesting to find that it took so long to get to that realization, or that you were actually forced to that realization. So thank the serendipity of the moment that it was you, and I think that you're exactly right. What's phenomenal about ACT UP and about that moment is it wasn't like they were in the middle of a house on fire. They were like in the middle of a house that had hundreds of fires. And the fact that they could do anything, let alone be as successful and inspirational as they were, is just an absolutely unbelievable thing. So can we do that next? Because I do want to get to your personal journey a bit, but I want to focus on this, especially for our viewers who are activists, who are organizers. How does one in a burning house not get engulfed in the smoke and the flames of it, and look to each spot and figure out how to work with the various different facets of what's happening in the moment, in a very emergent moment?
Okay, so let me tell you some of the takeaways, strategic and tactical takeaways from ACT UP that I think are helpful today. So the first thing is that it was not a consensus-based movement. So you did not have to agree. There was a lot of disagreement. ACT UP was very New York, and this is pre-gentrification New York. So there's a lot of arguing and, that type of thing, very confrontational. But it had a one-line principle of unity: direct action to end the AIDS crisis. And that was as opposed to social service provision. It was not a social service agency. It was a direct action political movement. If you wanted to do direct action to end the AIDS crisis, basically you could do it. So for example, the campaign to make needle exchange legal in New York. Needle exchange, where you give addicts, they can exchange dirty needles for clean needles so that they don't have to share needles, which was a mode of AIDS transmission. This was very controversial. David Dinkins at this point was the mayor. We had a black mayor. The black community was not in favor necessarily of needle exchange. People felt that they were enabling addiction, and they wanted an abstinence model. And instead, ACT UP embraced harm reduction, to try to make people's lives better without, having to force a complete turnaround in behavior that wasn't really possible. We already knew that. So because needle exchange was controversial, not everyone in ACT UP was in favor of the project. So if you didn't want to do needle exchange, you could argue with them but you wouldn't stop them from doing it. Ultimately, you just wouldn't do it. If something was going, so many things were going on in ACT UP that if you didn't like a certain project or you didn't agree with it, you wouldn't try to stop it from happening. You just wouldn't do it. You would find the people that you had shared values with, and you would organize something with them. And other people who didn't like what you were doing, they just wouldn't do that. And so this type of radical democracy allowed everyone to respond effectively from where they were at, instead of trying to force everyone to be in the same place. And this is really why ACT UP had so many different kinds of actions, so many different kinds of campaigns. We're in so many communities and so many milieu all at the same time, because people felt free to do something that they felt was meaningful. And I want to say that if you look back historically at movements that try to force people into one common analysis or one strategy, they all fail, because people can only be where they're at. And if you can't recognize that, then you're not going to succeed. So that's, like, in a sense, the biggest takeaway. The second issue is direct action and building campaigns. So the way that ACT UP would construct a campaign was that ACT UP would become the expert on the issue. So if you were working in housing, you would learn all about New York City policy, funding, how you get housing, you would do all of that. If you were on the insurance committee, you would become the expert on how people are excluded from insurance, pre-existing conditions, how they're overturned, who needs to do what. If you were a citizen scientist and you were in treatment and data, you learned all about the drugs, right? You became an autodidact, and people would be assigned one drug and they would learn everything about it and about the approval process and about the company that was making it and who they were, so that's the first step, is you become the expert on your issue. The second step is that you design the solution. So you're not in an infantilized relationship to power where you're like begging the government to fix it, because they're never going to. You design the solution that's reasonable, winnable, and doable, because you're the expert. And now you understand how the system surrounding your issue works. You present your solution to the powers that be, whether it's a pharmaceutical company, whether it's the government, whether it's the New York Times, whether it's an art gallery or museum, whether, whoever it is that has the power apparatus. And if they refuse to do your reasonable, winnable, and doable solution, you then do what Dr. King, who used direct action all the time, what he called self-purification, and what ACT UP called nonviolent civil disobedience. And you do a nonviolent, theatrical, direct action, an action of civil disobedience that communicates through the media to the public about what your solutions are. So the most famous direct action in American history is Black students in the 1960s sitting in at segregated lunch counters. Yes, they had a demonstration outside of people picketing with signs, end segregation. But by sitting in at the counters where they were forbidden, they created an image through direct action, an image of the world that they wanted to create. And that image was so strong and made such a clear statement that it's embedded in the American imagination ever since. And that's the kind of thing that ACT UP did. So when the Catholic Church was trying to stop public schools, not Catholic schools, public schools, from distributing condoms, ACT UP was like, well, you're going to intervene in the public sector? We're going to come into your church. And ACT UP disrupted Mass in December of 1989 and stood up to the power of the Catholic Church. And so it's these types of direct actions that communicate through the media to the public to inform them about what the problems are and what the solution is. And that's a campaign. You have a solution, you have a goal, you do actions towards your goal. Everything that you're doing is towards the next step. The worst way to waste people's energy is to just get them to go to a demonstration where they're standing passively, usually in the rain or the cold, and they're listening to speeches. That doesn't take you anywhere. It doesn't empower people. It's not active. it doesn't have it's not a part of a campaign. It's not a demand. It's just people show up and then they go home. The way you want movements where the members of your organization are constantly active and constantly building towards their goals. So that's a big lesson. Another really important lesson from ACT UP is that ACT UP was a predominantly white and male organization, but not an exclusively white and male organization. And the women and people of color inside ACT UP were very effective. So they never, ever stopped the action to do consciousness raising about racism and sexism. Because, you can spend your whole life trying to change one person and fail, right? Instead, women and people of color in ACT UP would marshal the enormous resources of the organization to help women and people of color. So, for example, ACT UP had an art auction that raised $650,000. And, every famous artist gave money to it. And the people who organized it, Patrick Moore and Phil Bin and Charles Hovland, were very, familiar with the art world, and they had a lot of access. Well, the Latino caucus knew that people in Puerto Rico with AIDS really needed support. And so they asked for money from this money to go to Puerto Rico, which they did, and they started ACT UP Puerto Rico. The group Fighting for Women with HIV ran a 4-year campaign to try to get the government to change their definition, and they did succeed. But, there were demonstrations, and women with HIV needed travel, and they needed to go testify places, and all of that was paid for by the money that ACT UP had raised. So in the end, this organization that was predominantly white and male ended up winning the most important victories for people of color and poor people and women in the history of HIV through this very smart, way of doing action. And then there's lots of little things that I learned by just reading interviews. Like when I was rereading the interviews, I noticed like someone would say, oh, I was hanging out at the Lesbian and Gay Center on a Monday, and I thought, who are those people in that room? Or another person would be like, I went to the Lesbian and Gay Center for my health care. And it was a Monday night, and there was an ACT UP meeting. And I realized that if the place where you have your meetings is a place that the community already identifies with and goes to, then you're much more likely to reach your community. And it's just like one of those things. Or like another thing was David Barr, who was one of the leaders of ACT UP. I write about this in the group. He had this idea about that the target of your action should be not symbolic, but literal. So when people would demonstrate in Washington, D.C. historically, they would go to the White House or the Capitol, the White House or the Capitol. I mean, when I was a kid, my mother was a social worker, and she would take us on buses with the National Association of Social Workers to protest the war in Vietnam, and the protest would be at the White House and the Capitol. But David realized that the actual enemy was the Food and Drug Administration, even though they were in this weird suburb in Maryland. So he came in and was like, we should do an action at the FDA, a place that people had never gone. And it was hard for people to wrap their heads around it, but he and Greg Bordowitz did a lot of internal movement lobbying and organized the FDA action, in which ACT UP shut down the FDA that day. I mean, there was no business as usual. All the workers were standing at the window staring at the action. And eventually won access for experimental drugs for people who needed them, even if the drugs weren't approved, speeding up the approval process. So it's these types of things that are really important and make a difference in how you build your movement. And the book is just filled with them, like every page, what is a media strategy? There were media professionals in ACT UP, like Mike Signorelli, who had been at People magazine, and Ann Northup, who'd been at CBS, and Urvashi Vad, who had a lot of experience. And the three of them came up with a media strategy for the FDA action. So that was the first national action of people with AIDS. People with AIDS came from all over the country. And what our media team figured out was connecting people with AIDS with the reporters from the newspapers from those cities. So it would be like, reporter from Minneapolis, meet person with AIDS from Minneapolis over here. Reporter from Austin, Texas, meet person with AIDS from Austin, Texas over here. So for the first time, The AIDS story had a local angle. And then the next day on the front page of each of these regional papers was a story about someone from their city who was openly a person with AIDS and in the context of fighting for their lives at the FDA. So, there's so much material. I could go on forever, but there's a lot in the book that I think would be helpful to activists today.
It's phenomenal, and I want to show our audience this is the book that we're talking about. We'll continue to talk about Let the Record Show, A Political History of ACT UP New York, 1987-1993. We have a dedicated volunteer in the comments section who will be giving you a link to our bookshop.org list, so you can go buy the book right now. You can click on it and not leave the conversation. You'll still hear Sarah, mostly a little bit of me, but go buy the book. This book is a phenomenal piece to have on your shelf. You should buy one for yourself, buy one for a friend, buy one for an enemy. You'll become a friend. Buy one for your favorite organizer, activist, or ally especially. And also always, I make sure that we say this, make sure your local library has a copy of it on their shelves. Because although we want everyone to support Sarah and buy this book, and support yourselves by buying this book, because it's going to change the way you organize and activate. But there are some folks who can't afford books, and your local library is a conduit to finding out information like this, to being inspired by books like this. So please do support, and it is a phenomenal tome. What I want to do is talk a little about how did they work through at that time the dual monsters of fear and anger, because those things can motivate, but they can also totally dissipate your energy and deflate what you're trying to do. So was there any sort of support system for the members of ACT UP to work through what was very much a trauma?
No, we thought about things really differently in those days. So it was the actions itself was how you expressed your emotions. And I just want to point out that, most people with AIDS never joined ACT UP. Most people who wanted AIDS to end never joined ACT UP. ACT UP, the meetings were between 300 and 700 people, and the largest demonstration was only 7,000 people. It was a small group that made it a way of life to be effective. And one of the questions I had when I was writing the book is, what do these people have in common? Who were these people who were able to accomplish so much? And so in the early years of interviewing, I interviewed for 18 years. So at the beginning, Jim Hubbard and I thought, well, maybe they all came from families that were community oriented. We weren't sure. So at the first 3 years, I asked a lot of questions like, did you go to church? Did your parents belong to the PTA? I don't know. And I couldn't find anything. There was nothing consistent. Some people's families, or some people had grown up with a very strong sense of community, and some people had grown up with no community. So that just didn't pan out at all. Then we started asking about foundational experiences with AIDS. And we found out that there were people in ACT UP who came to ACT UP who did not know a single person with AIDS. It was because they read an article or they saw something on TV and they knew that there was a terrible wrong going on, and they just went. There was a number of straight women in ACT UP. And when I asked them, how come you were there making a stand when most straight people in this country abandoned people with AIDS? They were like, I don't know why they weren't there. So it was just, but I finally kind of figured it out in year 8. When I interviewed this woman, Rebecca Cole. By the time I interviewed her, she was a prominent urban gardener. But originally, she had been an actress from the Midwest who had come to New York. She was working in a bar, and she ended up getting a job at this thing called the AIDS Hotline because it paid $10 an hour or something. And the AIDS Hotline was a total joke. There was no information. You would call the AIDS Hotline. It was these random actors working there. Nobody knew anything about AIDS. They didn't know nobody knew what the transmission was. Science didn't know. There were no treatments. So people would call and people didn't have the answers. Anyway, she was working there. And she got a call from a woman in Connecticut who had AIDS, who had been refused entry into an experimental drug trial because she was a woman. And Rebecca thought, well, that's crazy. So she started calling other drug trials, and she found out that they all excluded women. Now, the reason for that was that in the 1960s, there was a drug called thalidomide that was given to pregnant women, and many of them had children that were born without limbs. And pharma had to pay out huge settlements. So to protect their money, they decided to exclude women from experimental drug trials, so women couldn't get in. Well, Rebecca thought this was horrible. So she and a friend of hers called the CDC, made an appointment, went and met with them. And this is the beginning of the movement in solidarity with women with HIV. And then I was like, oh, I get it. What these people have in common is not experiential, it's characterological. They're a type of person who, in the face of a cataclysm, cannot be a bystander. And that's who these people were.
I think that must have been such a wonderful epiphany for you, to be working toward what's the thread. You know, we've had so many biographers on the show and so many historians on the show. I think of Hugh Ryan, and I think about Hugh Ryan's work. And, you know, we've talked a few times with him, and he's phenomenal. And finding that moment, finding that piece that, you know, you've had this whole, you know, gamut of experiences, and then that one voice that reaches out and puts it all together. And I think that that's a really important part of what you're talking about as well. This woman, Rebecca, who, you know, had this phone call because she's on this hotline, and then carried forth. And if she didn't do that, would someone else have done that? Would that have been found out? This was such a monumental moment, right?
Yeah, but there's so many like that. It was like, yes, these types of people who don't just let it go, who actually deal with it. Yeah.
And I think that's what's wonderful is we were talking at the outset, you were wonderful, and you're talking about the organizational aspect of things and how we put it together and platforming. But now I'd love to dig deeper into this, the individuals who were the ones that allowed that platform to work. You know, because you're always beset in any organization with voices crying out and people wanting to be heard, you know, valid or otherwise. And ACT UP did this extraordinary thing where all the voices almost were amplified all at once. And as you said before, you would just move to another room or another space, and you would say, okay, we're going to do this thing. And you may not agree with it. And it may not be your cup of tea, and you may not think it's going to work. But we're going to do that. And then you find what you're going to do that you think is going to work, and it's going to move it forward.
But also, it was amazing. It was all in the same room. It was in this crumbling old school that was the Lesbian and Gay Center in the former cafeteria. And people were like, in this corner, if you want to talk about this action, go to that corner. You back there. Just talk. I mean, it was like so simultaneous, so much simultaneity.
How does that work? That this astonishes me.
Okay, so here's the structure.
Yeah, please.
So there was a Monday night meeting every Monday, and there'd be at the beginning about 300, and then I went as high as 700 people. And there were official committees of ACT UP, like you could be on the fundraising committee, or you could be on the actions committee, or the media committee. And each of those committees had a representative that went to the coordinating committee. It wasn't called the steering committee because people didn't want to be steered. It was the coordinating committee, and they would plan the agenda, and they would meet separately, and they would try to give some structure. There were facilitators who were elected by the floor, and they tended to be like the sexiest, the funniest, you know, the most charismatic people, and they would run the meeting according to the agenda that had been set by the coordinating committee, but they would be flexible. And that's how official business would happen. But then there was a whole unofficial thing, which were these affinity groups. And these were groups of like 15 to 20 people who would meet at someone's house, and they would plan actions that were more civil disobedience oriented, or that you needed a smaller group. And they would not go to the main floor to get approval because we felt that we were infiltrated by the police. So this way you could plan something privately that was illegal, and you didn't have to bring it to the floor and expose it. So people could just do that without permission, but ACT UP, the floor, would give you legal support. Well, it turns out, and I have this in the back of my book, the Freedom of Information Act revealed that ACT UP was very heavily infiltrated. And I have the FBI papers in the back, and you can see that they're heavily redacted, and there were a lot of informers. So that fear was legitimate. And, you know, these affinity groups did amazing things, but also sometimes when members would become sick and die, the groups would become like care groups. So they were like little families. So that was sort of the other structure. And then the third structure was that people in ACT UP, so like I said, the group was predominantly white and male, and that's what the meetings would be. But then people were working with other people and other organizations and other communities. So some people were working with needle exchange, and some people were working with homeless people and homeless advocates. Some people were working with prisoners. Some people were working with parents. Some people, you know, so there was all, people were working with women with HIV. So they would be leaving the organization, but extending the reach of ACT UP and extending the relationships of ACT UP, working with Haitians, for example, and extending who was served. So it had this very, you know, plastic and very flexible structure that no one tried to control. And that's really important. Like, one of the things I talk about in the book is how little control there was. Like, somebody could say, we need someone to write a letter to the commissioner saying this, and someone would say, I'll do it. And that was it. You would never see that letter again. You would never go over the letter and correct things. The person was just left to do it, and they would just do it because there wasn't time for all of that. There wasn't time for all this controlling. And so it was very free in that way, and that was one of its great strengths.
I still am having trouble processing running an organization, you know, having the Biodressing Center for Social Justice and how we work. This is mind-blowing to me, and I want to put this all into action, you know, right when we get off the air tonight. And this is going to be, anytime a volunteer shows up at the center, I'm going to show them this episode of the Power Hour. I think that this is just such an important portal into how things can work. But it just seems to me, was there something, and forgive the term, magical about what was going on here that allowed it to work in the way that it did?
You know, it's people were fighting for their lives. People were dying all the time, and we were young, you know, and AIDS is a terrible death. It's not a cinematic death. The person really suffers, and you watch them suffer, and everyone is very motivated because of that. So because it was a constituency movement, in that it was a movement for the people who were in the movement. And so the needs of people with AIDS determine the agenda. And people with AIDS knew what they needed. They needed this kind of treatment. They needed this kind of benefits. They needed this kind of insurance. They needed this kind of housing, whatever. So they knew what they needed very concretely. So those became the goals. And so the things that people were fighting for were very real and were life-extending or life-saving. It wasn't theoretical. And so they needed to be effective. And apparently being theoretical or bureaucratic or trying to control other people inhibits being effective when you have a lot of different people responding at the same time. You know, when Jim Hubbard and I do something, in fact, we, in our 37-year collaboration, we kind of run it the same way that ACT UP ran it. I kind of do what I want, and he kind of does what he wants, and we check in, and I always do what I say I'm going to do, and he always does what he says he's going to do. So I don't have to check with him to find out if he did it or not. I know he did it because he told me he was going to. So then I can go to the next step. And so that's why you need people who are very accountable.
It just, I find it to be so phenomenal that you're talking about essentially, it's almost like it's not a movement or an organization, it's more of a passion project. Shared
It's a way of life. ACT UP was a way of life, right? Because it was to get life. And so people spent their whole lives in ACT UP. People lived together. They got each other jobs. They were doing ACT UP 5 days a week. You know, I mean, it had to be that way or it wouldn't have worked. I mean, you had to be really, really committed.
So you must see parallels now to the response to the pandemic, to the response to COVID, to what was happening then. What makes you really just so livid? Because there's so many lessons to be learned from ACT UP specifically, but from so much of the response to the AIDS crisis by those that were involved at the time. Do you ever feel like, I want to just go to a rooftop and shout, these are the things we need to do, this is going to save hundreds of lives?
Well, there's a lot of difference between AIDS and COVID. Let's start with that.
Right.
And one of the differences is that COVID is a collective public experience. It's talked about on TV every night. The president talks about it. ACT UP was AIDS was like our private nightmare. We couldn't get it into the public. That was the fight. In the book, I reprint this famous speech by Vito Russo, who was a gay liberation leader, and he says, it's like being in a war and nobody knows it's happening but you. That was our problem. So that's very different. What's similar is that every time there's a cataclysm in this country, it reveals the inequalities in the society. It reveals economic inequality. It reveals racism. They get revealed over and over and over again. And, ultimately, ACT UP was able, or the AIDS activism, including science and government, were able to beat HIV in a way, but they couldn't beat capitalism. And so the profit motive of the pharma became so obstructive, and that's a similar. And there are ACT UP people, former ACT UP people, who are involved in fighting that right now for the vaccine. The vaccine should be globally free and available, right? It shouldn't be hoarded by the United States or any wealthy country. And it's the same problem. It's about profit. And once again, science moved forward and capital keeps it back.
This has been so fascinating, and there's so much more. Everything you've shared tonight has been so incredibly informative, inspirational, and even things that I am going to move forward like almost immediately. Like I feel like at 8:01 tonight, when we get off the air, I'm going to start doing things much differently, and I think much better for our community. What was you've been doing this for 18 years, right? Collecting the oral history for 18 years. I have that right? So 18 years of oral history, then putting it together in the book and writing it out and putting it, pen to paper or keyboard to screen.
Right.
Was there an epiphany when you started to put together all the oral history into the book that really crystallized, and forgive me because you can't really put it into one piece, but is there one piece of it that was really striking to you, or a few things that really struck you?
I think that was at the beginning, when Jim and I realized that people in ACT UP were so effective that everyone thought that what they and their friends did was ACT UP. And we would go and interview everyone. They'd be like, you didn't know about what we did, but that was ACT UP. And actually, there was so much going on that absolutely no one had the organizational overview, because it was bigger than that. And that was very exciting to learn.
This is very exciting to learn. And I want to make sure that people understand that not only did you collect the oral history and write this book, but you were there. You were in the room. This is coming.
I was a rank and file member. I was never in leadership, but I went to the big actions. I went to the meetings. I was arrested twice. I came in as a reporter. I've been writing about AIDS since the early '80s. So yeah, I was there.
But that's the whole thing, isn't it? I think that there's a modesty to what you're saying. The whole point of the oral history and now the book itself is that the rank and file, so to speak, were the ones that made everything happen.
Everyone made everything happen.
Right, exactly.
It can't be any other way. And media distorts things because media emphasizes certain individuals, and some people were really, really amazing and brilliant and did their work incredibly well, but there were a lot of them. Thank
you for this book. This is the book again, Political History of ACT UP New York, 87 and 93, Let the Record Show, written by our wonderful guest tonight, Sarah Schulman. Thank you for the work you've done putting this together for the past almost 20 years, but then even before that, the work that you were doing boots in the ground. You are truly an inspiration to so many of our community, and I'm so thrilled that you were with us tonight. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you.
And we'd love to have you back. There's so much more that we can share. I feel like we do this
Or
once
bring
a
back
month.
some of the people I'm writing about. That would be great.
I would love that. Please
Yeah,
feel free to invite them on. I would love to talk to some folks. I would really be honored to do that. There are so many forgotten names and heroes of the movement that we need to amplify and elevate. So we'd be thrilled to be a part of that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again. Have a great rest of your night, and we'll see you again. Thank you.
Thank you.
So that is Sarah Schulman, everybody. This is the book I want to show you. Now that she's off screen, I'll say it again so you know that I'm not just being kind. There's nothing kind about saying this book is phenomenal. This book will really change your lives personally and organizationally. Especially if you're an activist, especially if you're someone who's an organizer, especially someone who wants to make a difference. This is literally a blueprint for doing that. But it's also an amazing story, and it's inspirational. And I cannot recommend it highly enough. And Chris is giving you the link right now to buy it from bookshop.org. We love bookshop.org because they give back to independent bookstores. So what I tell you, what a wonderful conversation. What an entertaining conversation. What an empowering conversation. As I said, the very epitome of what we hope the Power Hour will be. Thank you for joining us in virtual community tonight. We hope you got something from the show. We hope you were inspired by the show. As I said, Sarah's pivotal book, The Political History of ACT UP New York, Let the Record Show. There's a link in the comment section for you to purchase it. Please do so. Buy one for yourself, buy one for a friend, buy one for an enemy who will become a friend. Make sure your local library has a copy of this. We want everyone to buy the book, but some people can't afford every book. And their local library is their conduit for these kind of ideas and these kind of inspirations. So make sure your local library has a copy as well. Thank you all again for joining us tonight. We are here every single freaking weeknight, 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. So please be with us. We are here for you. Please be here with us. Until soon, much love and respect. Be good to each other. Be good to your families, chosen or otherwise. And most especially, my friends, please be good to yourselves. You need it, and we need you here with us.
We need in every community a group of angelic troublemakers.